According to legend, once upon a time, a very devout man was speaking to the Lord about the afterlife, and he wanted to know what heaven and hell were like. The Lord said to the man, "Come, and I will show you hell." And they entered a room where a group of people sat around a huge pot of stew. Everyone was famished, desperate, and starving. Each held a spoon that reached the pot, but each spoon had a handle so much longer than their own arm that it could not be used to get the stew into their own mouths. The suffering was tremendous. "Come, now I will show you heaven," said the Lord after a while. They entered another room, identical to the first. The pot of stew, the group of people, the same long-handled spoons, but here everyone was happy and well-nourished. "I don't understand," said the man. Why are they happy here and they are miserable in the other room when everything is the same?" And the Lord smiled. "It's simple," he said. "Here, they have learned to feed each other across the table." It's the difference between heaven and hell, how we choose to treat the people around us. A truth we know all too well. This past week, our nation once again descended into hell in the worst mass shooting in our history. 49 lives lost, 53 injured in a profound act of violence driven by what seems to be a deeply twisted concoction of callous indifference, prejudice, bigotry, and hate. Now, this would be horrible enough if it weren't for the fact that it just seems like this is this week's installment in a never-ending story of atrocity. Tune in next week. We've got more for you. Mass shootings, inner-city robberies, terrorist bombings, domestic violence, campus rape, a world continually descending into hell as people repeatedly choose to mistreat those around them. What's going on? And is there anything we can do about this? Or are we just stuck with this as a fact of life? What can we do? This is something of what I'd like to talk about this morning. Today, in our continuing study of our Savior's teachings through parables, our text is one that deals with precisely these issues, this all too common reality in our world. And I think that's something of what makes this one of the most consistently appealed to of Jesus' stories. It's the parable of the Good Samaritan. Consider the setting because it's crucial to understand what's going on here. Jesus is talking to some folks, and out of the group, a lawyer steps up to ask a question. Now, we can probably all make our own jokes about lawyers, but the fact is here, this is a spiritual man, and he asks a fantastic question, arguably the most important question of all time. How do I inherit eternal life? That is, how do I get into heaven? How do I go about experiencing the perfect eternal life of joy and peace that God intended? It's a great question. It is the question. And in answering it, it's important to understand that from Jesus' perspective, heaven is never just something that awaits us beyond this life, but rather something that begins immediately for the faithful. We can and we should experience something of it right now in this life. As Jesus once said, the kingdom of heaven is among you. It's here, now, for those who open their hearts to God. So also otherwise. Heaven and hell. No waiting. Right? So this is the question. How do I get in on heaven? Jesus, in his classic fashion, he answers the question with a question, essentially saying, well, I don't know, you tell me. Right? You see, he wants to probe a little bit deeper into this man's theology, into the deeper issues at work here. He appeals to the man's area of expertise. He's a lawyer, so Jesus asks him, well, what does it say in the law of Moses? Right? The man responds by quoting two passages from the Torah. He says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul and strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself." His answer to the path to heaven: love. Perfect love for God, inseparably joined to perfect love for one's neighbor. In fact, the man correctly combines these two into one. True love for God being realized only in love for neighbor, and love for neighbor being the truest expression of love for God. This together being heaven. Jesus rejoices. Amen, you got it, pal, he says. But then he adds this tagline: do this and you'll live. Essentially, you see, he nudges the door open to the real challenge at work here, namely, okay, but how do you actually do this, right? How does one become so completely, so perfectly loving? A challenge which the man with his trained, legal, argumentative mind, he immediately picks up on. Luke says that the man seeking to justify himself asks another question. Now, we don't know exactly what is implied in this phrase, whether it means he's just looking for proof that he's already fulfilling this command or for ways that he can avoid it. But either way, he asks, but who is my neighbor, right? And this time, Jesus answers his question with a story, the great parable. And what is this parable all about? Well, it's a story that is all about a world of violence and self-interest and callous indifference and apathy and fear and prejudice and bigotry and hatred. A world entirely like our own, into which one very ordinary person enters and chooses otherwise. And heaven shows up, calling people to its light ever since. It is a story of profound hope in a deeply broken world, which Jesus then concludes with a question of his own, namely, who then was neighbor to the man? That is really, who enabled all this heaven stuff to happen? The lawyer rightly answers, it's the man who showed mercy. That is, the man who, against all odds, against everything in and around him, said and did otherwise, chose love. Jesus then returning to his tagline, go and do likewise. Do this, and you will live. Love perfectly. Jesus' prescription, then, now, and always, for a world that is constantly seeking to descend into hell. What do we learn from this great parable about actually living this out in our daily lives? 3 starter thoughts. First, ask the right question. As mentioned, the parable is initiated by the question, who is my neighbor? A question that Jesus doesn't directly answer, but instead answers by turning it around into a brand new question, namely, who was a neighbor? That is, he shifts from identifying one's neighbors to actually being one. Crucial, his point being that this is the correct question to be asking, that the original question is not the right thing to even be asking in the first place, right? Now, I know this may all sound kind of like some sort of strange, the gospel according to Mr. Rogers or something, will you be my neighbor, right, But the point is, Jesus is essentially saying here that the correct question to be continually asking ourselves in life is not, who is my neighbor, but rather, am I being a neighbor? Because who is my neighbor inherently implies that as far as I'm concerned, not everybody is, right? Or needs to be, right? That we're looking for exemptions to love. And that's where the whole problem starts. This parable is so familiar to us that it's very easy to lose sight of just how jarring it would have been to its original audience. Understand, throughout the story, Jesus is trying to push against the prejudices of his audience to see where they opt out, the person or group that they exempt from love and mercy. Jesus begins by telling us specifically that this man was on the road to Jericho. And in Jesus' time, the Jericho road was notorious for its dangers. A person had to be an idiot to go there alone. Everybody knew that, right? The man gets robbed and beaten and left for dead on the Jericho road. No kidding. What did he expect? He had it coming. He got what he deserved. Jesus begins by playing into how we tend to blame the victim. Much like some say about gay people at a nightclub or a young Stanford woman passed out drunk behind a dumpster. Got what they deserved. Really? Jesus continues on. The first 2 folks to encounter the beaten man are religious folk, specifically leaders in the faith, but they just pass by. In fact, we're even told they go out of their way to get as far away from this guy as they can. It's another little shot here, you see. Religious folk often talking all high and holy, yet so often not actually doing what's right, and in fact getting far from it. Fortunately, we're not like that, right? People see only Jesus in us, right? Yeah. Jesus here appealing to anti-religion sentiment then and now. Pastor, all the biggest problems in history are caused by you religious folk. I don't have to go to church to be a good person. Heck, I can be nasty and judgmental all on my own. I don't need your help, right? Okay. Well, finally, having shown the failings of foolish people, deserving people, wicked people, corrupt people, phony people, the audience would expect the punchline, the final person who actually does what's right, to be one of their own. A good, ordinary Jewish lay person who stops to help, thus making a nice, anti-clerical, pro-common man, true righteousness lesson. However, who shows up instead? A Samaritan. Are you kidding? In today's context, substitute Muslim or terrorist, and you get the idea. As we noted in the past, in Jesus' day, Jews and Samaritans, they were bitter enemies. Jews considered Samaritans to be the lowest of the low. They were religious half-breeds. They were evil. They were unclean dogs. In fact, to Jesus' original audience, the title Good Samaritan would be considered an oxymoron, two words that contradict each other, like Microsoft Works or United Methodist, right? You know? Right? There is no such thing as a Good Samaritan. The only kind of Good Samaritan is a dead Samaritan. Jews despise Samaritans and vice versa. Yet a Samaritan is the one who Jesus has stopped and helped, the one who out of simple human compassion tangibly enacts the perfect love that began the whole discussion. And why does Jesus do this? Simple, to hit his audience between the eyes with this question: who is the last person you would expect to do right? Who's on your out list? You see, Jesus sets up his audience. He sets them then and now on a path, the Jericho road, so that he can confront them, confront us with the people we don't believe deserve love, don't believe have earned love, and ultimately the people we believe are beyond love. Thus asking, who are you personally exempting? Essentially, through this story, Jesus first seeks to say to every individual in all time, before we start talking about the wrongs of the world, before we start dealing with the downfall of humanity, we've got to address some really deep, nasty stuff in your heart. Specifically, however, wherever love is lacking, and it's playing into the absence of love in the whole world, and it's creating its hell. You know? Basically, who is it for us? Who is it for you? Is it some group, some nationality, some race, some ethnicity? Some lifestyle, some faith? Is it some specific individual, somebody who's hurt you, some grudge you hold, some forgiveness you will never offer? Well, welcome to hell. Jesus' first point here, there can be no exemptions, period. You want to fix the world? You want to see heaven happen all around you? Stop unconsciously looking for who you can write off. Stop intentionally justifying who you are allowed to hate, and instead resolve today, right now, this instant, to rid your heart of all such absence of love. Now, obviously, this is incredibly difficult. It's human nature. It almost seems natural to judge and to condemn. We're always looking for some way to do it. Makes us feel better. I mean, we'll look for the tiniest thing. It's like I'm reminded of that old joke. I've told in the past, but it fits right now. You know, walking across a bridge one day, one man saw another man standing on the edge. He's about to jump off to his death. So the first man ran over and said, "Stop, don't do it." "Why shouldn't I?" the second man said. Well, the first man said, well, there's so much to live for. "Like what?" The second man said, well, are you religious or atheist?" asked the first man. "Religious," said the second. "Me too," said the first. "Are you Christian or Buddhist?" "Christian," said the second man. "Me too." Are you Catholic or Protestant?" "Protestant." "Me too." Yeah. Are you Episcopalian or Baptist?" "Baptist." "Well, me too." Right? "Are you Baptist Church of God or Baptist Church of the Lord?" Right? "Baptist Church of God." "Wow, me too." "Are you Original Baptist Church of God or are you Reformed Baptist Church of God?" "Reformed Baptist Church of God." "Really? Oh, man." "Are you Reformed Baptist Church of God, Reformation of 1879, or are you Reformed Baptist Church of God, Reformation of 1915? "Reformed Baptist Church of God, Reformation of 1915. "Really?" the first man replied. "Then die, heretic scum," and he pushed him off the bridge. Right? We divide, we judge, we condemn over almost of nothing. This is the reality we live every day, a reality we often even justify, right? So what are we to do? Very simple. Give our lack of love to Jesus, for only in the power of his perfect love can we overcome it. Understand, this is the subtext of the parable itself. As Jesus tells the man to go and do, to love perfectly, the very fact that the man has a problem with the issue, that's the issue. That we can only do this by inviting Jesus to come and do it for us, right? Will we do this, or will we go on in our hatred and our division? Do you recall the famous quote? It was found on the crypt of a 12th century bishop in Westminster Abbey. It reads, "When I was young and free and my imagination had no limits, I dreamed of changing the world. As I grew older and wiser and realized the world would not change, I shortened my sight somewhat and decided to change only my country, but it too seemed immovable. As I grew into my twilight years, I settled on changing only my family and those closest to me, but alas, they would have none of it. Now, as I lay on my deathbed, I suddenly realized that if I'd only changed myself first, then by my example, I could have perhaps changed my family. And from their inspiration, I would have been better able to help my country. And from there, I may have even been able to change the world." It all begins in our own hearts. Thought number one in bringing heaven to a hell-bent world, ask the right question. Thought number two, do something. Preacher Gordon MacDonald writes, "Years ago, I flew to Minneapolis to give a speech at a conference at the Minneapolis Convention Center. Near downtown Minneapolis, my taxi was stopped at a red light 4 cars back from the crosswalk. I noticed a homeless man lurching between the cars in the middle of the street. When he got to the front of my taxi, he fell and landed on his chin, and I could hear the thud. His chin split open, and there was blood all over the place. I got out and looked over the top of the door at this man 6 feet away, and these thoughts went through my head. 1, I have a brand new suit on that my wife just bought me. I can't afford to get it messed up. 2, I have to get to the Minneapolis Convention Center to speak in 15 minutes. 3, I'm in a strange city, and I don't know what to do. 4, I don't have any medical training. I wouldn't know how to help this guy. And I wonder if underneath there also wasn't a 5th thought, namely, man, if you're dumb enough to get yourself that drunk, why should busy people stop and help you? I'm ashamed of this. I can't believe a Bible-believing Christian could find such thoughts in the filing cabinets of their soul. For a few seconds, these thoughts militated against any movement on my part. Before I could come to my better senses, a teenager, the kind of mangy-looking kid I would normally write off, came rushing to this man's aid. He did what I should have done so that I was able to get back into my taxi and go on to the convention center to speak about sensitivity and caring for the needs of others. Is it going to be talk and thought, or is it going to be action? Something of our second point here. In the parable, of course, as mentioned, the first 2 people who come upon the injured man are 2 members of the religious establishment. It's a priest and a Levite. And as the story makes clear, these 2 not only failed to stop and help the man, they actually go out of the way to get to the other side of the road to avoid him, right? Now, it's very interesting to note that Jesus doesn't give any reason as to why these 2 failed to offer aid. Is it that they believe that the man, maybe he's already dead, so there's nothing can be done, and according to their faith, to touch a corpse would make them ritually unclean? Is it that they fear hanging around, possibly being beaten and robbed themselves? Is it they're just in a rush to get where they're going and they don't want any interruptions? Fear, apathy, judgment, we don't know. But what we do know is that there are probably a million different reasons, many of them undoubtedly quite logical, as to why they shouldn't have stopped to offer aid, and that is exactly the point. There are always a million possible reasons available for why not to do something good, why not to reach out and help someone, and only one reason to do otherwise, and that is love. And this, you see, is the clergyman's crime, their complicity in the brokenness of the world. They just don't want the demand of love really placed upon them. They don't want to get involved. They look at life more for reasons to avoid action than for opportunities to serve. And must we not admit that we are often the same? One author writes, "It is rightly said that the road to hell is not paved with good intentions, it's paved with good reasons why not to get involved in God's work in the world. Understand, life's road always has 2 sides. On the other side, you will get to Jericho in a hurry. On the victim's side, you may get into trouble in a hurry. On the other side are pavement and promises. On the victim side are potholes and problems. On the other side, you insist on your rights. On the victim side, you accept your responsibilities. On the other side, you can make a good living. On the victim side, you can make a good life. On which side of the road do you live and work? On which side of the road will we live and work? This is the second challenge of this text. Simply put, in a deeply broken and hurting world where hell far too often breaks out, are we going to do something? Right? Notice that Jesus has two identifiably religious people fail to do what is right. His point being to all religious folks everywhere, you are the guys who know better, right? But far too often you don't do anything. Stop just weeping for the world and do something. As we look at our broken world, particularly this past week, what are we going to do? Beyond just talking about it, beyond just despairing it, what are we actually going to do about it, And what can we do? Well, on a personal level, we can be the voice that speaks up whenever we hear any kind of statement of prejudice or hatred. Because whenever we remain silent in such moments, we tacitly give our approval, and that evil persists. On a political level, we can get involved, vote, contact our representatives, tell them what we think, push for change. This past week I went online to see how long it takes to get a hold of our representatives. Went online, just put in New Jersey federal officials, right? It took me 23 seconds to get to our senators' web pages. That's how long it takes. It's 23 seconds to maybe make a change, And in all of this, looking to what the Samaritan does for the man, notice that he doesn't just slip the injured man a 20 and then go on his way. No, his actions are numerous, attending to various interrelated issues, and he commits not just to the moment, but to the long term. He says, I'll be back, So important. Working for change in the world means realizing that the solutions to the problems are rarely simple. Do this one thing and everything's fixed. No. Rather, things are intensely multifaceted, requiring attention to numerous issues. It's hard work. And also that they demand commitment to the long haul, not the short attention span so prevalent in our culture today. It requires people willing to stay at the troubles, As we looked at our broken world this past week, what are we going to do? Consider this true story. When Betsy Wiggins opened her front door and saw the woman in full black face veil coming up her flower-lined walkway, she wondered if she had done the right thing. It was 11 days after 9/11, and Mrs. Wiggins, a speech pathologist and the wife of a United Methodist minister in Syracuse, New York, had called the local mosque and invited a Muslim woman she did not know to come over for coffee. She and the Muslim woman, Dania Wellman, a medical lab technician, sat in the Wiggins' breakfast nook for hours and talked about their faith, their careers, their children, and their mutual despair over the terrorist attacks. They bonded that day and decided that they should start a broader discussion. As a next step, Mrs. Wellman invited 9 Muslim women, and Mrs. Wiggins invited 9 others, Christians, Jews, and a Buddhist, to join them for a traditional Methodist potluck supper at the big stone fireplace in her living room. They began by talking about the Quran and Islamic rituals, but they soon found themselves in intimate discussions about how they pray, what they believe about birth and death, why they do or do not wear scarves, headscarves. It was hard for the group's feminists to reconcile their assumptions about Islamic oppression of women with a room full of dynamic, assertive, and educated Muslim women. I think we had 7 meetings about the veil, Mrs. Wiggins said. We finally got over the veil, The group outgrew Mrs. Wiggins' living room and took on the name Women Transcending Boundaries. Soon the group was organizing international dinners to raise money for girls' schools in Pakistan. Members volunteered to teach English and sewing skills at a center for immigrants and refugees. They organized a community walk that they called the Journey to the Tent of Abraham, with stops along the way at churches, synagogue, and a mosque. They turned a vacant lot into a community garden where immigrants from Myanmar, Vietnam, and Burundi grow vegetables. We didn't want to just have tea and crumpets, Mrs. Wiggins said. We wanted to do something positive. And such it was that a few years later, in February 2003, when Mrs. Wellman's daughter was tragically killed in an automobile accident, women of many faiths filled the mosque for her funeral. The world changed because some ordinary people chose not to just despair it, but to do something. Thought number 2 in bringing heaven to a hell-bent world, do something. And then finally, thought number 3, be the one. The great preacher George Buttrick writes, "Who is my neighbor? I do not know, Jesus retorts, but life will reveal him to you. He is not of one class or nation. He is anybody in need. You will find him as you journey. You cannot and will not plan for him. You will come upon him, as the text says, by chance. He is not of this or that religion. He is not sinner or saint. He is a certain man, any man needy at your roadside. True neighborliness is not curious to know where boundaries run, for it seeks not for limits, but only for opportunities. In the end, returning to where we begin, consider the ultimate point of the parable. That bad stuff happens, but that one person, each one of us, can change that world, can alter the reality that evil set into motion. That no matter who else does what, we can be different, and we can enact heaven. And understand, because of our deeply broken world, somebody needs each of us each and every day. Be sure of it. Might we be that one who changes the world? You know, I can't help but think of the victim in the Stanford rape case, who says she now keeps a picture of two bicycles over her bed to help her remember the two young cyclists who rescued her, right? And who, when those thoughts start to overwhelm her, remind her that there are good people out there, that life is good, you know? In the end, the Good Samaritan is the model of life, not because he does anything particularly remarkable nor superhuman. Quite the contrary. Everything he does is well within the reach of almost everyone. Rather, what makes him great is simply that he puts aside the issues that far too often guide us: fear, self-interest, and judgment. He refuses all this, and instead, as Jesus emphasized, simply allows himself to be moved by the plight of another. Might we do the same? This week, someone in this world will desperately need us. They need us. God needs us to allow ourselves to be moved by their pain, to set aside all issues of self and other, friend and foe, ally and enemy, and to just act out of love. Heaven there to be realized. In closing, consider the following. When Jontel Franklin's mother lost her battle with cancer on February 7th, 2009, no one was surprised to hear that Franklin, a senior forward for the Milwaukee Madison High School basketball team, was not going to play in his team's game that day against DeKalb High School. But then he showed up. Midway through the second quarter, Franklin walked into the gym ready to play. The only problem was that his name hadn't been entered into the scorebook. That meant that if Franklin took the floor, his team would be assessed a technical, 2 free throws from the DeKalb team, which in such a tight game could mean all the difference. Aaron Womack, coach of the Milwaukee Madison, and Dave Rollman, coach of DeKalb, both met with the game's referee, begging the referee to make an exception to the rules. Though the referee was sympathetic to the situation, he stressed that the rules have to be followed regardless of extenuating circumstances. And that's when something truly special happened. When the referee would not budge, DeKalb's Darius McNeil stepped up and volunteered to shoot the 2 free throws. When he turned to make his way to the line, his coach, Coach Roman, called out, "You realize you're going to miss, right?" McNeil nodded affirmatively. McNeil went to the line. The referee handed him the basketball, and he set his feet to take a shot. But instead of a perfectly executed free throw, McNeil just tossed the ball about 2 feet in front of him, and the ball slowly bounced out of bounds. The referee picked the ball up, handed it back to McNeil, and McNeil did the same thing for the second shot. It didn't take long for the opposing Milwaukee bench and the entire gym to realize what McNeil and his team had just done. And with that, the crowd erupted in a standing ovation. Milwaukee went on to win, helped by this selfless act. So after the game, McNeil was questioned about helping his opponent win. He said simply, "I did it for a guy who lost his mom. It wasn't anything amazing. It was just the right thing to do." A great scholar writes, "It all began with the question, who is my neighbor? To which Jesus could have simply said, everyone. But instead he turns this around to become the true proper question of all life, not who is my neighbor, but am I being a neighbor? For to be a neighbor with a thorough zeal answers both for him that gives and him that takes the deeper question, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? The answer is that the inheritance is ours already. It is the impulse to be neighborly. We realize the inheritance best when this impulse is translated into the better language of deeds. In truth, religion in its outworking is neighborliness, and neighborliness in its final implications is religion. A religion which passes by on the other side is a lie. It's not a faith. This story, which begins in a theological controversy, ends in a description of first aid. It arises in a question of heaven and works itself out in an act of roadside assistance, as do our lives. This week, bring heaven to a hell-bent world. Ask the right question, do something, and be the one. Do this, and you will live. Let us join together in singing our closing hymn, number 2171 in The Faith We Sing. Make me a channel of your peace. Would you please stand?